When I bought the old mill property, everyone focused on the buildings. The crumbling stone foundation, the weathered timbers, the quiet stretch of land that looked forgotten by time. But I was drawn to something else entirely. The lake. It wasn't large, and it wasn't pristine. The water sat calm behind an aging spillway, fed by a narrow channel that had once powered the mill generations ago. Locals called it Old Mill Lake, though no sign marked it as such. It had been there longer than any house in the surrounding HOA development. Longer than the HOA itself. Longer than most of the rules they liked to enforce. The sale documents were clear. The lake was included. The shoreline, the dam structure, the inlet and outlet. All part of the deed. I had the surveys, the historical records, and the permits transferred during closing. Everything was legal, documented, and approved. That didn't stop the looks. Within a week of moving in, I noticed people lingering near the water, walking dogs a little too far past the trail, standing on the bank as if they were waiting for permission they assumed they already had. One afternoon, I found lawn chairs set up right at the edge, facing the water like it was a public beach. I introduced myself politely, explained that the lake was private property now. Most nodded awkwardly and moved on. But one woman didn't. She crossed her arms, looked past me at the water, and said, "This lake has always belonged to the community." I told her I understood that people were used to accessing it, but ownership had changed. I even offered to share copies of the records if she had questions. She didn't ask for them. She just said, "We'll see about that," and walked away. That was my first warning. The HOA letter came 2 days later. Not a greeting, not a welcome, a notice. It claimed the lake was a shared recreational resource, and that restricting access violated HOA expectations. Not rules. Expectations. They demanded I restore access immediately and remove any signage suggesting private ownership. I responded with facts. Copies of the deed. Survey maps. Historical filings showing the lake predated the HOA by nearly a century. I assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. More people started showing up. Fishing lines cast from my shoreline. Kayaks dragged across my land. One morning, I woke up to a small group picnicking near the spillway. When I asked them to leave, they said the HOA told them they could be there. That's when I put up the signs. Clear. Polite. Private property. No trespassing. The reaction was immediate. Emails flooded in accusing me of being hostile, selfish, unreasonable. One message warned that emergency access could be compromised by my actions. Another suggested the lake was regulated, and therefore not really mine to control. Then came the knock. 2 police officers stood at my door late one afternoon. Calm. Professional. One of them asked if I was the owner of the mill property and the adjacent lake. I said yes. He nodded and explained they'd received a 911 call reporting an active dispute involving restricted access to a body of water. The HOA had called emergency services. I invited the officers in and laid everything out on the table. Deeds. Maps. Permits. Federal waterway documentation tied to the old mill channel. They took their time reviewing it all. One officer finally looked up and said, "This isn't an HOA issue." He was right, and the HOA had no idea what they just triggered. The officers didn't leave right away. After reviewing the paperwork, they stepped outside to make a few calls. I could see them through the window, standing near their cruiser, gesturing toward the lake and then back toward the mill channel. Whatever the HOA expected to happen when they dialed 911, this wasn't it. When the officers returned, their tone had changed. Still polite but firmer. They explained that the lake wasn't just private property. It was tied to an old mill race that connected to a downstream river system. That connection mattered. It meant certain federal and state waterway codes applied, regardless of who lived nearby or what an HOA believed. One officer asked if I'd ever restricted flow or altered the outlet. I told him no. I'd done nothing except restrict recreational access to my land. That distinction mattered too. Water movement versus land access. The lake could remain regulated while the shoreline stayed private. The officers left with a warning note attached to the call record. No violation. No follow-up, just documentation that the issue was civil, not criminal. The HOA, however, wasn't done. The next morning, a certified letter arrived claiming my signage created a safety hazard by limiting community access to a regulated water feature. It cited vague language, no statutes, and zero jurisdiction. But the tone was confident. Overconfident. I forwarded the letter to the regional water authority listed in my closing documents and asked a simple question. Does restricting access to my shoreline violate any federal or state waterway regulations? Their reply came the same day.
No.
They clarified that while the waterway itself was regulated for flow, habitat, and discharge, access rights were governed by property law. The shoreline was mine. The dam was mine. The spillway maintenance responsibility was mine. And unauthorized access could actually create liability issues for me if left unaddressed. That email changed everything. I sent a copy to the HOA board. The response was silence. For about 24 hours. Then came a new tactic. Notices appeared on community boards warning residents that the lake was under review and advising caution. The wording was careful now. No claims of ownership. No demands. Just concern. The same concern they hadn't shown when people were trespassing. A few residents still tried to test it. One afternoon, I caught a man fishing from the bank. When I asked him to leave, he said the HOA told him federal law meant I couldn't stop him. I handed him the printed email from the water authority. He read it, folded it, and apologized. The HOA scheduled a meeting and invited a representative from the county. They didn't invite me. They didn't have to. I attended anyway. The presentation didn't go as planned. The county official explained, plainly, that the HOA had no authority over the lake, that emergency calls should never be used to settle property disputes, and that continued interference could result in legal consequences for misuse of services. The room went quiet. Questions followed. Uncomfortable ones. About why the board hadn't verified ownership. About why residents were encouraged to access land they didn't own. About why police were involved at all. The HOA president tried to regain control, but the tone had shifted. Authority was slipping. Confidence had evaporated. The narrative they'd built collapsed under basic facts. After the meeting, 2 board members resigned. That evening, I walked the shoreline alone. The lake was still, unbothered, unchanged by any of it. Water doesn't care about paperwork or power plays. It just follows the path it's given. The HOA had tried to weaponize emergency services. Instead, they'd exposed how little ground they actually stood on. And the fallout was just beginning. The days after the meeting felt different. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just tense. Like everyone was waiting to see who would move first now that the rules were no longer on the HOA side. They tried acting like nothing had happened. No announcements. No apologies. No clarification to residents about the 911 call or the federal explanation that followed. But silence doesn't erase consequences. It only lets them grow. Residents started coming to me directly. One asked if the lake was going to be taken away. Another wanted to know if fishing would ever be allowed again. A third quietly admitted the board had told them the police were on their side after the call. I answered each one calmly, showing documents when needed, explaining that nothing had changed except enforcement of ownership. That's when frustration turned inward. People began questioning the board. Why call 911? Why involve law enforcement over access that was never guaranteed? Why hadn't they checked the deed before sending letters and notices? Those questions spread faster than any official update. The HOA attorney finally reached out. This time, there were no demands. No accusations. Just a request for a conversation. We met at the mill property, standing near the spillway, while the lake sat quietly behind us. He acknowledged the federal designation of the Waterway connection and admitted the HOA had overstepped. His concern now wasn't access. It was liability. He explained that encouraging residents onto privately owned, federally regulated shoreline could expose the HOA to serious risk. Injuries. Environmental violations. Misuse of emergency services. Each one carried consequences they didn't want to test. I listened. Then I asked a simple question. Why did it take calling 911 for you to check? He didn't answer that either. Within a week, the HOA issued a revised notice. Carefully worded. It stated that Old Mill Lake was private property, that residents were not authorized to access it, and that any future concerns should be directed to the board, not emergency services. No mention of mistakes. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just correction. But the damage was already visible. Attendance at HOA meetings dropped. Trust evaporated. 2 more board members stepped down citing personal reasons. The president remained, but her authority was gone. Every decision was questioned now. Every email scrutinized. The lake became a symbol, not of exclusion but of overreach. I installed a simple gate along the main access point. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make boundaries clear. No one challenged it. No one tested it. The confidence that once drove people onto my land without permission had disappeared. Then the county followed up. A formal notice arrived addressing the misuse of emergency services. It wasn't a fine, but it wasn't nothing either. It outlined expectations and consequences if 911 was used again for non-emergency property disputes. The HOA was officially on record now. That changed how everyone behaved. I noticed fewer complaints in general. Fewer threats dressed up as concerns. When power gets checked publicly, it tends to retreat quietly afterward. One evening, I stood by the water as the sun dipped behind the trees. The mill channel carried water downstream like it had for 100 years, indifferent to titles and boards and authority letters. It struck me how fragile control really is. How quickly it collapses when facts replace assumptions. The HOA thought calling 911 would force compliance, that fear would do the work facts couldn't. Instead, it brought scrutiny. And scrutiny brought answers they didn't want. They hadn't just lost access to a lake. They'd lost the illusion that they could decide what wasn't theirs. And once that illusion breaks, it never fully comes back. What finally broke the stalemate wasn't another argument or another meeting. It was paperwork. 2 weeks after the county notice, I received confirmation from the Regional Water Authority that the mill channel and connected lake were officially logged in their federal registry. It wasn't new information, but it was now formally acknowledged in a way that removed all ambiguity. The designation didn't grant public access. It imposed responsibility, maintenance standards, environmental protections, reporting requirements. And every single one of those responsibilities rested with me. I forwarded the confirmation to the HOA attorney with a short message. Any further interference with shoreline control or access enforcement would be treated as obstruction of federally regulated maintenance. That got their attention. The tone of communication shifted immediately. Emails became cautious, carefully phrased, heavy with legal language and light on confidence. The board requested a mediated discussion, not to negotiate access, but to clarify boundaries of authority. That phrase alone said everything. They knew they'd crossed a line, and now they wanted it redrawn where they could see it. The meeting took place in a neutral office downtown. No residents. No posturing. Just attorneys, a county liaison, and me. The HOA's position unraveled quickly. They had no deed, no easement, no historical claim that held up against recorded filings. The belief that the lake was community space turned out to be nothing more than tradition backed by assumption. Tradition doesn't survive contact with federal code. The mediator laid it out plainly. The HOA had no jurisdiction over the lake or its shoreline. Any attempt to regulate access, signage, or usage was unenforceable. Worse, encouraging residents to trespass after being notified of ownership could expose the board to personal liability. That was the moment fear replaced pride. They agreed to formal terms. A written acknowledgement of private ownership. A prohibition on future notices referencing the lake as shared space. Mandatory correction of prior communications sent to residents. And a clause stating that emergency services would never again be used to address property access disputes involving the lake. I didn't push for damages. I didn't need to. The concession itself was enough. Within days, a new letter went out to every homeowner.
Clear. Direct.
No soft language this time. Old Mill Lake was private property. Access, without permission, was prohibited. The HOA did not and never had authority over it. Residents were instructed to respect boundaries and contact the board with questions, not law enforcement. Some were angry. Most were embarrassed. The lake went quiet again. No footsteps along the bank. No fishing lines. No kayaks scraping across the grass. Just water, trees, and the low sound of flow through the spillway. Exactly how it had been when I bought it. The HOA retreated. Not loudly. Not publicly. But completely. Notices stopped. Emails ceased. The president remained in her role, but her influence was gone. Everything she touched now required approval. Oversight had replaced autonomy. I made improvements that spring. Reinforced the spillway. Stabilized the shoreline. Installed monitoring equipment required under the federal designation. Work that should have been done years ago, when the lake was treated as a free amenity instead of a responsibility. No one complained, because now everyone understood the difference. The HOA thought authority came from volume, from pressure, from calling 911 when they didn't get their way. What they learned instead was that authority comes from jurisdiction, and jurisdiction has limits. They found those limits the hard way, and they stayed well behind them after that. By summer, Old Mill Lake looked the way it should have from the beginning.
Calm. Maintained.
Undisturbed. The water level held steady behind the spillway, the channel carried its flow downstream, and the shoreline showed no signs of foot traffic or misuse. For the first time since I'd bought the property, the lake existed without argument attached to it. The HOA kept its distance, officially and unofficially. No more letters. No more concerns. No board members walking the boundary pretending curiosity. The new policies were posted publicly and followed carefully. Even casual mention of the lake in HOA communications disappeared entirely, as if acknowledging it at all might reopen a wound. Neighbors adjusted. Some were disappointed at first, but most accepted the reality quickly once they understood the legal side. A few even apologized for assuming access where none existed. One older resident told me they'd always wondered who actually owned the lake, but never thought to ask. Assumptions had filled the gap where facts should have been. What stayed with me wasn't the conflict, though. It was how easily authority can drift when no one challenges it. How something can be treated as communal for years without ever being legitimate. And how fast that illusion collapses when documentation enters the conversation. Calling 911 had been their last card. A move meant to intimidate, to escalate pressure without responsibility. Instead, it brought oversight, records, external eyes. The very thing they'd avoided by acting informally for so long. Once federal codes were involved, everything slowed down and became precise. There was no room for implication or tradition. Only compliance. That precision changed how the HOA operated beyond the lake. Residents noticed it. Meetings became shorter. Votes became clearer. Decisions were documented instead of assumed. Fear of scrutiny has a way of improving behavior when nothing else does. I didn't celebrate. I didn't make a point of it. The victory wasn't dramatic. It was administrative.
Quiet.
Sustainable. Which made it permanent. The lake taught me something unexpected. Ownership isn't just about possession. It's about responsibility. Once the waterway was officially acknowledged, the burden shifted fully onto me. Maintenance wasn't optional. Reporting wasn't flexible. Protection wasn't negotiable. But that was a trade I was willing to make because responsibility came with control. And control came with peace. Every now and then, someone new moves into the neighborhood and asks about the lake. I explain politely. Private property. Federally regulated. Not accessible. They nod and move on.
There's no argument now.
The boundary is established, reinforced by more than signs. It's reinforced by record. Looking back, I realized the HOA didn't lose because I was aggressive. They lost because they were careless. Careless with facts. Careless with authority. Careless enough to think an emergency call could replace due diligence. It couldn't. Old Mill Lake still feeds the downstream river like it always has. It still reflects the sky in the evenings. It still does what water does best, move forward without concern for the noise around it. The difference is that now, so does everything else. The HOA learned where its reach ended. And I learned that sometimes the strongest defense isn't confrontation. It's documentation.